Etienne Marlowe did not want to be a soldier. He was 22 years old, worked in a bakery in Lyon, and had never held a rifle in his life. But it was 1916, and France was bleeding, and the army did not care what Etienne wanted. He was assigned to the 87th Infantry Regiment, a unit already worn thin by 2 years of war. The men he joined were not fresh volunteers full of patriotic fire. They were survivors. Tired, dirty, suspicious of anyone they did not already know. And Etienne, pale and soft-handed, smelling faintly of flour even after weeks in the field, was very easy not to like. His squad leader was a man named Sergeant Gaston Vrel. Vrel was from Marseille. He was brought across the shoulders, missing the tip of his left index finger from a childhood accident, and he had the particular cruelty of a man who had suffered enough to believe that suffering was the only honest teacher. He took one look at Etienne on the first day and made a decision about him. That decision did not change for a long time. The early weeks were a kind of education Etienne had not been prepared for. His rations were taken. Not always, but often enough that he learned to eat quickly and say nothing. His boots were moved while he slept, once placed in a puddle of standing water so that he spent 3 days with wet feet in October mud. When he made mistakes during drills, which he did, because he was new and frightened, the laughter from the others was not the kind that invited you in. It was the kind that reminded you that you were outside. There were 4 men in the inner circle of that squad. Vrel, obviously. Then there was Corporal Denis Four, a schoolteacher before the war, which surprised people until you spent 5 minutes with him and understood that intelligence and decency are not the same thing. There was a man everyone called Buchin, a wide, slow-speaking farmer from somewhere near Reims who followed Vrel with the loyalty of a dog and the conscience of a stone. And there was Luc Tessier, the youngest of the 4, 19 years old, who was clever and quick and had learned that cruelty directed at someone else meant cruelty was not directed at him. Etienne understood all of this. He was not stupid. But understanding why something is happening to you does not make it stop. He wrote letters home to his mother in those months. He did not tell her the truth, because the truth would have frightened her and there was nothing she could do about it from Lyon. He told her the men were rough but decent. He told her the food was bad but he was eating. He told her he was learning. That last part was true, at least. He was learning that silence was armor. That if you did not react, you gave them less to work with. That small usefulness, knowing where something was kept, being able to fix a small mechanical problem, quietly sharing information before it was asked for, could buy you temporary peace without requiring you to become something you were not. He was also learning the landscape of the war itself. The trenches near Arras where they were stationed in late 1916 were a particular kind of misery. The ground was chalk and clay, the drainage was poor, and the smell of the place, wet earth and cordite and something worse underneath both, was something that never fully left a man even after he was somewhere else. The front line was a few hundred meters from German positions. Long enough that most days were quiet. Short enough that you never forgot what was on the other side of that distance. In December of 1916, something happened that changed the shape of things slightly. The squad was sent on a nighttime reconnaissance patrol, 3 kilometers east along the line toward a section near the village of Neuville-Saint-Vaast. German activity had been reported. Unusual movement. The kind that made officers nervous and therefore made sergeants irritable and therefore made everyone else miserable. Vrel led the patrol. The night was very dark and very cold, and they moved in silence along the outside of the trench line, low and slow. Etienne was near the back. This was where they put him, because no one wanted to walk behind someone they trusted with their life, and that is what the back of a patrol means. At some point Etienne noticed something. The ground ahead, maybe 15 meters past where Four was stepping, had a particular quality to it in the low light. He had spent weeks studying this terrain the way frightened people study things, carefully, obsessively, looking for information that might keep him alive. He knew that the section ahead had been shelled 2 weeks ago. He knew that the subsequent rain had shifted the surface. He knew that what looked like solid ground was almost certainly not. He said nothing for 2 full seconds. This is important. Because in those 2 seconds he thought about the men ahead of him, what they had done to him and what they continued to do, and he made a calculation that was not about revenge and was not about heroism. It was simpler than both. He was not the kind of person who could watch something bad happen when he could stop it. He said, quietly, Vrel. Stop. Vrel turned with the expression he always wore when Etienne spoke. Somewhere between annoyance and contempt. Etienne moved forward past the others without asking permission, which he had never done before, and he crouched at the edge of what he'd seen. He pressed his hand into the ground. It sank. Beneath a thin crust of dried surface there was nothing solid. A shell crater filled with water and mud, topped over by a few days of cold weather into something that looked like Earth but was not. For would have gone through it. In the dark, loaded down with equipment, he would have gone through it and he would have struggled, and in struggling he would have made noise, and they were close enough to German positions that noise at night was a different kind of danger. Vrel looked at the ground. He looked at Etienne. He said nothing. They went around. The patrol completed without incident. They returned to the trench line before dawn. Nothing changed immediately. That is not how people work. Vrel did not apologize. Four did not apologize. Buchan continued to be Buchan. But the quality of the silence around Etienne shifted slightly. There is a difference between being invisible because you are beneath notice and being invisible because people are not sure what to do with you yet. He had moved, without ceremony, from the first category to the second. Tessier started talking to him. Small things. Complaints about the food, questions about where Etienne was from, the ordinary low-stakes conversation of men in close quarters. Etienne answered carefully, without warmth he didn't feel and without coldness that would have cost him ground. He was still learning. The winter of 1916 into 1917 was brutal across the entire front. The Nivelle offensive was being planned at levels far above anything these men could see or understand. What they could see was mud and cold and a rotation of days in the line followed by days in reserve that blurred together into something that had no beginning and no end. Men in the regiment talked about the war ending. They always talked about the war ending. It was the thing you said when you had run out of other things to say. In April of 1917, the offensive began. Etienne did not know the strategic details. He knew that they were moving. He knew that the objective involved the heights above the Aisne River, the Chemin de Dames, a name that sounded gentle and was not. He knew that the officers were confident in the way that officers were always confident before something went wrong. The first day of the assault was a catastrophe. The German defensive positions were far stronger than French command had calculated. The promised artillery support did not break the lines the way it was supposed to. The men who advanced into open ground found that the ground was not as open as the maps had suggested. Etienne's regiment was pushed into the assault in the second wave, which meant they advanced through the debris of the first wave, which prepared no one for what was ahead. Vrel kept the squad moving. This was what Vrel was genuinely good at, moving forward, not because he was unafraid but because fear had never successfully argued him out of anything. They made 200 meters before the German machine gun position on their left flank opened up and everything became confused and loud and very small. They went to ground in a shell crater. All 5 of them. This was a different kind of proximity than the trench. In the trench there was always somewhere to go. In a shell crater in the middle of an open advance there was only the crater. Four had been hit. Not badly, a graze along his right forearm, but bleeding steadily. Buchan was pressing his hand to it and Four was telling him to stop in the tight, controlled voice of a man managing pain. Tessier was flat against the forward lip of the crater, watching the German position. Vrel was doing the calculation that sergeants do: what is ahead, what is behind, what are the odds of either. The machine gun position was maybe 80 meters to the left, elevated slightly on a piece of ground that jutted up from the surrounding terrain. It was covering a wide arc. As long as it was operational, their squad was not going anywhere. Neither were the men in the 2 other craters Etienne could see to the right. Etienne looked at the position. He looked at the terrain between here and there. And he did the same thing he had done on the patrol in December. He read the ground. There was a shallow depression running from their crater leftward, not a trench, not anything man-made, just the way the land happened to fall. It was not deep enough to crawl through standing, or even on hands and knees. It was deep enough, barely, to move through flat on your stomach, pressing yourself into the earth and moving with the particular slow, controlled motion of someone who understood that speed was the enemy here and stillness was survival. He told Vrel what he saw. Vrel looked at him for a moment with an expression that had something new in it. Then he looked at the depression. Then he looked back. He said, "Can you get there?" Etienne said he thought so. Vrel said, "Then go." What happened in the next 20 minutes was not dramatic in the way that war stories are usually dramatic. There was no sprint across open ground. There was no moment of standing tall against the sky. There was a young man from Lyon who had worked in a bakery pressing himself flat into the mud of the Chemin de Dames and moving forward at a pace that would have frustrated anyone watching, inch by inch, keeping his profile below the slight rise of the depression, not breathing fully, not thinking about what would happen if he was seen, just moving. He reached the left side of the German position where the ground rose slightly and the machine gun crew's attention was directed entirely at what was in front of them. He had 2 grenades. He used them. The position went quiet. He lay there for a moment in the ringing silence after. Then he heard Vrel shouting behind him, not at him, at the rest of the squad, moving them forward, and the advance continued. They made their objective by late afternoon. The Nivelle offensive overall was failing, would continue to fail, would eventually break the morale of the French army in ways that took months to repair. But for this squad, on this day, they had their piece of ground and they were alive. That night, in a captured German trench that still smelled of its previous occupants, Vrel sat down next to Etienne. He didn't say much. Vrel was not a man who said much when it mattered. He put a hand briefly on Etienne's shoulder, the way you might grip a roof beam to test if it would hold, and then he took his hand away. For looked at him across the trench and gave him a single nod. Buchan offered him tobacco, which among Buchan was a significant gesture. Tessier said, quietly, "I knew you had something in you." Etienne thought about saying something to that. He thought about saying that it hadn't been about them, that it had been about himself, that he had simply been unable to watch something preventable become catastrophic. He thought about pointing out what the previous months had been. He said nothing. He took the tobacco. He sat in the captured trench while the light came down over the Aisne Valley, and he thought about Lyon, and his mother, and the bakery, and the particular smell of bread in the morning before the day had complicated itself. He thought that if he survived this war, and he was not certain that he would never again be the person who was small enough to make someone else smaller just because they could. He filed that thought away and kept it. Etienne Marleau did survive the war. He returned to Lyon in 1919, thinner than he had left and quieter in ways that took years to understand. He went back to the bakery. He eventually married a woman named Colette who appreciated that he listened more than he talked. He had 2 children, a boy and a girl, and he did not tell them many stories about the war. The one he told them, eventually, when they were old enough, was not the story of the machine gun position. It was the story of the patrol. The cold night near Neuville-Saint-Vaast, the ground that looked solid and wasn't, the 2 seconds in which he chose. He told them that the hardest thing in the world is to do right by people who have not done right by you. Not because it is noble. Not because it earns you anything. But because the alternative is becoming someone you will have to live with for the rest of your life. His children did not fully understand this when he told them. They understood it later. The end.